Welcome everyone to another, not exactly another, but I think it's a first episode of METACRISIS now in English. So happy to start this new version and new phase for METACRISIS, where we are going to record once a month with the central theme on metacrisis and this invitation for a deep listening to the near future. To do so, I'm really glad that I'm inviting my friend, brother, and partner, Sean Hargens, to co host this piece of Metadoxas with me. Welcome, Sean.
Hello, listeners. I'm excited to be joining Marcelo on this new Metadoxis adventure. Marcelo and I have a long history of collaboration, which we'll share some of those details today. And it's been a real focus of both of our lives to look at, explore, and try and understand the metacrisis. So I'm excited to be exploring this topic with Marcelo and the many guests that we will have join us. And it should be an important conversation because the metacrisis affects all of us. I think it's the opportunity, the global opportunity to transform individually and collectively. And I know transformation has been a focus of both of our lives in many contexts. I'm excited to explore to see how we can bring guests into the conversation and explore how can we be transforming across the planet to better respond to and address these many challenges we are now facing.
So, for those who is listening for me for the first time, I'm just to introduce myself. So, I am 57 years old. I'm in my second marriage with Delmar. I have two kids. Actually, they are no longer kids. Always kids for me. But Ananda is turning 33 in 2 weeks, and Pedro, who is living in Romania playing volleyball, is 31. I am passionate to transformation, evolution. I had a long history of working for organizations, and then I found She, and then I've been developing She as an ecosystem to transform individuals' organizations for the last 8 years. I first started studying integral theory more than 22 years ago. It's where kind of two different avenues in my life integrated. So I always had this seeker in me to pursue personal transformation through different therapies and spiritual paths, alongside with a very traditional career as active. When I found the work of Ken Wilber back in 2000, it kind of gave me a framework to integrate all my quests and journeys, and since then I've been working to bring consciousness and transformation to organizations and how people relate to work and their own self transformation, and it's been this for the last 20 years. The midst of this journey, I had the pleasure to meet Sean, and then I'll share a little bit how I met Sean. I'm currently living in the mountains now after the pandemics. I'm passionate to nature, to sports, to spirituality, and alongside with transformation as a whole and how we as humanity are going to face the challenges we are facing. So, Sean, I think it would be great to listeners to know a little bit more about you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm based in Maine in the United States, which is in the Northeast. It's up near Canada. So we get a lot of snow in the winter, but it's beautiful. There's a lot of nature here. We just moved here 2 years ago during the pandemic. Similar to Marcelo moving to the mountains during the pandemic, I also moved to the mountains and the coast. Before that, I was living in California, and I had been in California for 25 plus years. So it was a really big move for us, my wife. We have two daughters, a 14-year-old and a 17-year-old. I just dropped my 14-year-old off to her first day of high school today. So she's very excited. And my older daughter, Tatiana, my first daughter is Athena. My older daughter is living in Italy for the year. She taught herself Italian during the pandemic. And so she's been very passionate about Italy and Italian culture. And so she decided to spend her junior year abroad living with a host family and going to school in Italy. So we're missing her, but we're excited because we're being forced to go to Italy in December for 3 weeks during the Christmas break. So that'll be fun. And I know Marcelo loves Italian food because whenever I go to Brazil, we always go out to amazing Italian food. So I'll have to get some ideas from Marcelo of what restaurants to go to in Rome.
There's no way to make it wrong in Italy, so that's anyone that you pick must be good.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I'm excited. Like Marcelo, when I discovered Ken Wilber's work, it really kind of changed my life. I discovered it when I was living in Africa, working with the Peace Corps, a nonprofit program. And then I moved back to the States and I got in touch with Ken Wilber and got involved with his Integral Institute. So I've been applying integral theory in ecology, education, business, coaching, psychology ever since. And it's been a main focus of my life. I'm a business coach and consultant. I founded Meta Integral about 10 years ago. I run a master's and PhD program that focuses on integral theory. It's called Integral Noetic Sciences, which is essentially a program that studies consciousness from an integral and scientific perspective. And so I tend to be an academic, but also really love the application of integral theory. And I've taught a lot of students over the years in various programs on how to take the ideas of integral theory and apply them to a variety of challenges and opportunities. And Marcelo and I think we met first in like 2010, just right as my book Integral Ecology was coming out. And so we've had a variety of collaborations since then. And then maybe the last thing I'll say is like Marcelo, I love athletics. I spend a lot of time sea kayaking, mountain biking. Anytime I can get out in nature is one of my main ways of exercising and staying happy and healthy.
As you are introducing yourself, a lot of different memories of all those many years, like 13 years now, just pop up. I think we have a lot of anecdotes and stories to share to people about our journeys and adventures together. But just to give to people a little sense of, so Metadoxus has been almost 2 years at place. And actually, the idea of having Metadoxus as a podcast came up during the beginning of the pandemics, where when we are in lockdown, we start recording every day from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. or longer. We were doing something to get the community together, people really facing hard times. And so we just create a sense of community. And then we start bringing more perspectives and at the same time inviting guests. Sean, you were one of the guests during those days that we are in the beginning of the pandemic, not exactly knowing how it was going to end and how we are going to cope with that reality. And then there was one person who challenged me saying, that you are a kind of, you bring very provocative reflections, but more often than not, it is hard to people to grasp. I think you should start having a podcast where with more time and guests, you should bring more of your perspective. At that time, at Chi, we were working with an organization in Minas Gerais, PhD Professor Alfredo. He is a scholar and researcher in complexity, transdisciplinarity. And now he's retired, Sean, and I share with him the booklet or article on interdisciplinarity, and he's getting crazy. He's going so deep, we have to invite him. But part of the conversations I had with him, he also challenged me, and then that's where the name Metadoxus came up with. So, Sean, you are very much up about meta, and perhaps in some sense you will explain a little bit about meta and the notion of paradoxes, which I think holding both meta and paradoxes at the same time can be very helpful to at least start giving sense and meaning to or creating narratives that are more relatable to reality. And so that's where Metadoxus started. What I realized is that I have a very big network of audience that speak only English, both in integral community and theory U community. and I always love to do stuff with you, Sean. So then I had this idea. So why not having this month recording on Metadoxus, focusing on metacrisis? And another aha moment when I was talking to Galvi was that so everything that I consume around metacrisis is in English, mostly from US or European scholars and researchers. Then I thought, in one hand, that it would be great to have more of this conversation in Brazil and also bringing voices and perspectives from the global south. So, and this also is one of the intentions in having these episodes of Metadoxus focusing on metacrisis every month, bringing more awareness around it for Brazil, and also from time to time we are going to have guests. This is not only going to be me and Sean, but also we are going to have guests, and along the time we want to have guests coming from the global south that can bring different cosmovisions and perspectives to the topic. I don't know if you have anything yet to add, Sean, but it's a little bit of a story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll just start with what you were just highlighting in terms of the focus of the conversations we want to have are really aimed at engaging the global south, including perspectives and community leaders and organizational leaders, business leaders, have really important things to say about the meta crisis, but who might not have a lot of visibility in the larger conversation around the meta crisis. The meta crisis really requires all of us from all around the globe to be in dialogue and listening deeply to each other. And I think you're right that there tends to be this US centric or kind of, English speaking centric focus to a lot of these interesting conversations. And so when you approached me about doing this series, I was very excited because having spent a lot of time in Brazil over the years with you and traveling globally for my own work, I'm really aware the challenges of a lot of important conversations are trapped in the English language and they're US centric. And so the opportunity that you're giving me and us here to expand that to a larger audience and to explore how might we include additional voices really appeals to me, because obviously the meta crisis is not just happening in the US or Europe. It's happening everywhere. And there's a lot of interesting people out there doing great work, and one of the reasons why, and I loved your description of the name Metadoxa, bringing together paradox and meta, because I did a similar thing in, 2011 when I founded Meta Integral, right? Bringing together meta and integral. My impulse there was I'd been a longtime student of Wilber's integral theory, but I was also aware of some other integral approaches like Edgar Morin's work, which is very important to the transdisciplinarity movement. And then also Roy Bhaskakar's work. Edgar comes from France, Roy Bhaskar comes from England. And, Roy Bhaskakar's developed what's called critical realism as kind of a philosophical approach. And so as I started studying these other two kind of integral theories, I realized that there were more integral theories than just Ken Wilber's integral theory. And so I wanted to create a space that brought these other theories into dialogue with each other. And part of the impulse was to get out of the US-centric discussion of integral. So by bringing in, a British philosopher of science, bringing in a French public intellectual, and also, as there's Sri Aurobindo, and there's a lot of other interesting voices with an integral perspective. I wanted to create a space where integral could be in dialogue with integral, and that we could really explore lots of different types of integral. Struggling with paradox is one of the best ways to develop integral consciousness and also integral applications. I think it's probably the main driver of human adult development is working with polarities and paradox. And the meta crisis has so many paradoxes. It's just like, it's so complex. There's so many contradictory dimensions, depending on what scale you're looking at or talking about, depending on what countries and perspectives you're including. Of listening deeply to people around the planet, around these topics, we're going to be navigating paradox over and over again. And so how do we get better, and how do we model a conversation that can include paradox? One of the biggest challenges in the meta crisis is the culture wars and the polarity between different political parties and perspectives. and it's really painful, right? And so we really have to get better at listening to perspectives that we don't agree with, or that seem wrong or paradoxical, or that they're missing some important element. So I love this vision of a metadoxis, of a meta view on paradox. So I think it's perfect for the kinds of conversations we want to create with others here.
I knew you were gonna love it. Just sharing a little bit how we met, and I think, as I said in my intro, I learned integral back in 2000, and then it's part of this kind of a global south. In Brazil, we have what we call stray dog syndrome. So my first book was Theory of Everything, and then I started reading a lot. And then I said, I have to bring it to the organizations in Brazil. So then I start traveling to US and Europe to find people implementing integral in business. And then it was a kind of disappointment and also excitement, because when I start meeting people, I just realized that those guys were having the same questions I was having. And actually, there was nothing relevant being implemented in organization back in the beginning of the 2000s. So, and then I start doing a lot of reading, a lot of programs, and also inviting people to come to Brazil. So we brought Tom back, and then there was this very interesting story that I was, because I started studying states of consciousness in the beginning, as most of us, based on the spiral dynamics. And then I realized the work of Susan Cook-Greuter. And then I entered the Susan Cook-Greuter website. I think it's back in 2006. And there was a phone number. Then I called, and then Susan herself answered the phone. I said, I would like to talk to Susan. This is her.
Oh my gosh.
She's so nice and sweet, and she's amazing. For those who doesn't know, Susan Cook-Greuter is a pioneer in the research, and she is one of the students of Jane Lovingard, which is a kind of a branch of studying adult development and stages of consciousness. And then when I called her, she said that this is great. I'm going to introduce you to Bina Sharma, who is a person who is in charge to bring my work to the world. And then I brought Bina. I was working at that time as a president for Latin America, CEO for Latin America for DBM. And then it was amazing, because Bina, she's not only doing the work of bringing Suzanne's work alive, but she's a kind of a toolbox with so many different tools and approaches, and the work of polarity. And then we brought Suzanne, and then is exactly the moment I joined Natura. And then I was in charge to many dimensions at Natura. And then I was already following your work, Sean. And then I saw you were coming to Brazil to a conference, I think it was in Minas Gerais, in Belo Horizonte.
Yeah, on climate change.
Yeah, and climate change, that's right. And then I called Bina, asking her to make the intro. And then she made the intro, and then we started working. And so in these 5 years that I stayed at Natura, Sean was a huge partner. Natura was kind of integral informed, but not to the depth of implementing and bringing it to projects and realities. And that there was a moment at Natura where we have 12 different projects running. Do you remember that, Sean?
I do. Oh my God.
Yeah, integral education, management, leadership, brand, sustainability, innovation. So it was amazing.
It was amazing.
And then in the midst of this period at Natura, I asked you, and then you introduced me to Sean, to Ken, and then we went to the Lofty, stayed with Ken, and then Ken gave us the blessing to bring Integral Institute to Brazil. And then we always kept doing work and being close. I was leaving my last position as an executive. I was in the end of my role at Laboratórios Fleury, and then we kept talking and working. And then there was this invitation to me to be Meta Integral CEO when we met at Pittsburgh. So that was an amazing moment where we shared a lot. We did a lot of stuff. Also, during my time at Natura, we brought a cohort of Integral Coaching Canada and Brazil, as I think was the first cohort outside of Canada. And you are one of the teachers for the group. There was this amazing project for IBM where we did this trainee program with the notion of hacking the organization, of having a group of young people who were going to help to develop and mature to hack the organization without caring much about being accepted and belonging to the organization. It was a kind of a 2-year program. Then we have been making amazing integral projects over the last years. Integral education platform called Vivecer for Institute Peninsula, the whole architecture and research around longevity and well-being for Plenai and Plenitude with the 2 events. But I think what's still going on, it's one of the things that I'm most proud of it, is the work of CMI that we. So you had an embodiment program in US that you invited me to teach there, and then there was the beginning of She, and then we designed, you, me, and Dana, we designed the CMI, the embodiment program that we have that is now going to the cohort 8. We are more than 250 people now, with exactly dream that we had is coming through. So this notion of a big community sharing deep transformational work and tools and methodology and vision to be together somehow. And so we started in the beginning of cohort 1 more like with friends, being guinea pigs for us, you and me, designing module to module how it's going to happen. And now it's so again, it's we've been weaving stuff together for many years now, Sean.
Hearing you go through all those projects, it makes me realize that each of those projects was, a 1 to several year project. Like they weren't these little engagements, they weren't like 3 months, 6 months, like all 10 of them that you just outlined. Some of them are still running, like the CMI program, but like Natura was like 5 years, and I was traveling down to Brazil almost every month for a week. I was like, spending 1 week every month in Brazil, working on these 12 projects. Everything just flowed into other activities, right? So the Integral Institute, launched in Brazil, just emerged out of those early years in Natura. The IBM program just was a natural thing that just emerged. And that kind of became a template for long-term work with young leaders that informed the Embody program that I was doing in the US. And then the CMI program, which we did with Dana in Brazil, which is still going on. And I really just came to love Brazil and the Brazilian culture. And I have so much love for all the people who have kind of come and played with us in all of these different sandboxes that we've created. And yeah, the work with Plenai was amazing. My wife's getting really into longevity now. And so I've been giving her a lot of pointers and examples from the research I did during that period. And so I've been getting back into longevity and, Living to 100 series on Netflix with Dan Bueller, and he was at the event in Portugal where we were at. So just a lot of interesting connections. And I feel like, we've had a great collaboration. We've had a lot of good success with our initiatives. I think they've all really helped pioneer what it means to apply integral. And you're right, the story you told of going to the US and excited to kind of learn from the masters on how to apply these ideas to business and organizations. You were actually the master. You were the pioneer. You were pushing that application way before all of us in the US. In the US, we were looking at education and medicine and, psychology. We weren't yet thinking about business and organizations. That really emerged much later. And interestingly, I'm about to start teaching a new course at the university called Wisdom Design. And it's really, most of it's about applying integral principles to organizations and businesses. And how do we take the wisdom from integral and the contemplative traditions and use that to run our organizations? And a lot of what will be in that course is the kind of stuff that we've taught in the CMI program. So there's all these ways in which our different trajectories keep weaving and supporting each other. And Metadoxis in this new series is just another example of us collaborating as friends and colleagues. And I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too, Sean.
So I'm sure people, might be wondering, why do we need another podcast? There's a lot of podcasts out there. I think this is a really unique opportunity to, as Marcelo was saying, to bring meta views to explore the paradoxes of our global moment and to bring fresh new voices that have been underrepresented in the global South into the conversation, right? So I think there are a lot of podcasts, but I don't know of anything that's doing something along the lines of what we're doing. And the whole idea of metacrisis has gotten a lot of interest in the last 2 years, and we'll probably talk about that and what that means and what the metacrisis is. But I think if we're really going to solve the metacrisis or move towards generative solutions, we need a bigger conversation with people all over the world, and particularly the global South. So I think this podcast provides a unique platform to really help bring that together. And so it was just a very natural yes for me when Marcelo presented the invitation, because of our long history of working together and my own passion for the metacrisis.
Perhaps leveraging from what you just said, Sean, you could bring a little bit about what metacrisis is, giving a little bit of framework to the audience to understand where we tackling and what are the frameworks that we want to use to talk about it.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, so Edgar Morin, who's one of the people I mentioned, the French intellectual that's been very involved with the transdisciplinarity movement, in his books, he talks about the polycrisis. And so the idea that there's many crises happening at the same time. But the way he talks about the polycrisis is that it really kind of emphasizes the external realities, the political issues, environmental issues, economic issues. It doesn't so much include the crisis of meaning making or the existential crisis that we're facing with a lot of people committing suicide and just the alienation with modern society. So while I was working on a book with Roy Bashkar and Nick Headland and Merv Hartwig, we were putting together this book that had these different chapters, some from integral theorists, some from critical realists, and they were all talking about how do we bring these two integral theories together to solve the issues on the planet. In that introduction to that book, we coined the term metacrisis, and I think we might actually have been the first people to use this phrase. And what we meant by that is we were thinking of Ken Wilber's 4 quadrants, right? That there's psychology, there's behavior, there's the systems, and there's a culture. And we're basically seeing that there's a major crisis or several crises in each of these big domains. It felt natural to call it a metacrisis, partly because I'd already founded and launched Meta Integral. So I just think meta. Everything's meta to me. And so if we're talking about the crisis, I naturally think meta, right? So, if you have a hammer, you're going to look for nails. So this idea of metacrisis was just very natural to me. But it also felt like a way of creating a framework to talk about how all of these crises are interrelated and they're amplifying each other. Right, so we have an existential crisis. I mentioned that. We have health crisis of obesity and stress and drug use. We have ecological and social crises. We have an ethical crisis and a cultural crisis. We talked a little bit earlier about the polarities and the political dynamics that are happening. Right, so the meta crisis, and this is why you need meta theory. You can't really see and deal with the meta crisis unless you have a really big map. Unless you understand the relationship between psychology and adult development, between the environment, between behaviors and health, between educational, political, and economic systems. There are a lot of people making good progress on these different crises, but they tend to specialize in just one or two areas. We need to step back and see the complex and paradoxical ways that these crises are interrelated. You won't be able to see this very well, but here's this chart of my friend Nick Headland, who talks about the metacrises, and it has all these different domains. There's 3 major domains: ethical crisis, eco-social crisis, and existential crisis. And then around each one of those, there are like 10 different crises, right? Like unsustainability, climate change, AI, nuclear war, gender inequality, homophobia, classism, psychological exhaustion, suicide epidemic. And then you have this picture of this head, this person looking at all of these crises. And then this is an epistemic crisis. Like, how do you and I how do we see all of this? How do we make sense of all of this? How do we interpret all of this? And so this is why you need a meta framework or integral approaches. Is like, how do we understand the role of worldviews? How do we understand cultural dynamics, right? So it's a really big challenge to deal with this crisis. And there are not clear, obvious solutions. And this is why we need many conversations. We need to listen deeply to each other. And it's only going to get worse. like it's, it's like you look at the global trends with AI and CRISPR and the UAP topic now in the US, the crisis in education. Like, there's every reason to think that things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. So we need to be talking about this and exploring new ways of thinking about it.
Yeah, to me, I think the first time I heard Metacrisis was from you, but actually was I went to see Ken for the last time back in 2018, and then he mentioned his dialogue with Jordan Peterson. I think it was exactly when Jordan Peterson was coming out, and then the movement of rebel wisdom. And I think it was when I kind of started paying closer attention to the notion and conversation. And also when I read Harari's book on the 21st lessons for the 21st century. So, and then I start diving deep, and then I found the work of Daniel Schmatzenberger and John Vervaeke. John Vervaeke's The Awakening for the Meaning Crisis, 50 episodes, was very enlightening for me. Harari's and Schmetzenberger and John Vervaeke, they have something in common that I'd like to explore with you, because when you bring the existential crisis on the quadrants, perhaps a kind of on the same level as the rest of the crisis, those guys, they bring it in a slight different perspective, which is kind of all those crises that you just showed in Nick's chart. It is a kind of a consequence of a deep lack of meaning that humankind ended up getting into along the centuries. And I love the way Vervaeke talk about, and it perhaps is something that similar to what Ken used to say, that religions can be the conveyor belt for the evolution. If all the religions can get together and converge to what's common in all the traditions. So somehow Vervaeke say that we need a religion that is not a religion, or say a kind of a meta-narrative that gives sense and meaning.
Right.
So the kind of the person you said with what the heck is going on, and that's, I pretty much agree, and I think you agree. So that perhaps the only possible single solution is how we collectively evolve in terms of our psychology and experience of reality. But I'd like you to comment.
It's true. It's like, since, when we first used the term metacrisis in this book in 2016, I think it was a term that was very ripe. And so I'm sure others started using it maybe before or around the same time and independently, and also a lot of people in the meta-modern kind of approach, they read this book and they picked up on that word, and it just kind of spread like wildfire. And so there are currently, 4 or 5 major approaches to the metacrisis, and they have slightly different ways of thinking about it and identifying different layers of it. And this can be one of the things we explore on this series. And because I think this gets us into some of our first paradoxes, right? Is the existential crisis the result of the metacrisis, or is it the cause of the metacrisis? And I would say yes, both, right? Paradoxically, it is. It plays both roles. It's also partly why in this chart you have the existential crisis down here as one of the 3 big crises, but then you have the epistemic crisis of the person over here. So I think part of what you're highlighting is like, do we call this the existential crisis, or do we call this the existential crisis? There's a lot of feedback loops that occur between our individual psychology and our existential concerns, what's happening politically, economically, environmentally. Whenever someone makes a strong position of this started first and then this happened or this caused that, I'm always a little suspect.
Yes.
Right? I think that's probably one valid way of understanding it. But I think part of what the metacrisis asks us to do is to go beyond those simple causal dynamics and talk about tetra enmeshment of how many of these factors are simultaneously influencing each other in very dynamic, complex ways. And that's part of the challenge of the meta crisis is we're not used to thinking in that way. We tend to still be very linear in our orientation, and so that all of our listeners can benefit from the paradoxical understandings of the meta crisis. Because really, it's only in sitting in the tension of the paradox that I think the new solutions will begin to emerge.
I love this notion that we are entangled in all those different fields, past, present, and future. They are kind of influencing us. And then I went to watch Oppenheimer, the movie, yesterday.
Oh, wow.
And then I've been thinking a lot. It was kind of impacted me. So because I'm living in the mountains, I was not in Sao Paulo to see right after it was launched. So I only saw yesterday. And then you see first the complexity of all those brilliant kind of physics like Einstein and Oppenheimer and Niels Bohr and all those guys and everything that was emerging with quantum mechanics. And so kind of a 20, 30 years of everything abolishing. And the war itself, because the kind of the engineer mind of the Second World War that was present, and then they won the war, and then bringing it to reality after and create the Cold War and everything else, and the atomic weapons and the role they play. So September 11 is another example of a collateral effect. So that's just building on this notion and the invitation to the guests to transcend the idea of a causal and effect in complex issues, which is being in the system, acknowledging our entanglement and bias and blind spots, because the collector effects of all those that discoveries and the bomb and everything. And then there was this argument that launching the bomb killed much less people than if because Japan was never going to. So Japan is never going to surrender. So they are going to be a kind of a huge fight throughout the years. And also the way Oppenheimer was treated by U.S. authorities in regarding to the communism and everything, and the implications of physics and nuclear physics and quantum physics since that moment to now. So, and again, I think all the topics that you mentioned, AI, the CRISP and everything, as kind of a atomic discoveries itself, each one of those at the same time. And also, I was reading the other day Nora Betteson article around, so in complexity, we talk a lot about emergence and how important it is to pay attention to what's emerging. And she was just talking about the pre-emergence. So because when something is emerging in the system, it's already too late because it's being boiled and being metabolized throughout decades and centuries maybe. So and then pay attention to the pre-emergence is perhaps more important than emergence. And I think that those concepts are important for the listeners to, when they listen to us talking and perhaps what seems to be ambiguous or kind of paradoxical is just an invitation to not jump to the conclusions and be open to questions and reflection.
It really remains to be seen, like, how are we going to navigate all of this? So yeah, it's like it's a very interesting and overwhelming period in our history as a species and as a global civilization, and it's a real threshold. And yeah, so fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be, I mean, even over the next year, I think every year there are just radical things happening. Cryptocurrency stuff, and like blockchain, even new types of organizational design are really interesting experiments happening in that space. So there's a lot of creativity happening, but there's also a lot of change that's really shifting, all of our reference points, and it's hard to keep up with it. Deep fakes and fake news, and it's just like, wow, it's like we're really being stripped down to some of our core elements of what does it mean to be human. And how do we reconnect with some of that, and then how do we kind of build anew?
Yeah, and perhaps the invitation to people to also, as they listen to us, can be also a first-person investigation of themselves. I met Gail Oshalka. I think you know Gail, right?
Yeah.
And she just finished with her PhD on climate change and stages of consciousness using theories of Fallon theory. it is kind of a clear, but nobody's it is really paying attention to that, because I think there is the conclusion of her research is astonishing, which is even the most well-intentioned people leading the conversation around climate change, they don't have enough cognitive emotional capacity to bring up the solutions that will really deal with the challenge. So and then you pick so climate change and everything else, all those different crises that we just mentioned. It is exactly what we are talking about. There's this big cognitive, emotional, and ethical gap in the leaders who is dealing with those challenges. And I think perhaps our conversation here can help the listeners to bring themselves back to their own development and helping them to reinforce or to commit to, with their only transformational journeys and engaging with communities that can perhaps navigate and go into the direction of holding more of the complexity of the times that we are facing.
Yeah, and here's another one of the paradoxes we're going to keep exploring, I suspect. Many of these global trends that we started to name are developmental catalysts. There's the real opportunity to deal with them, like climate change. We have to grow and develop. We have to become more emotionally and morally and interpersonally and ethically mature. At the same time, these issues tend to create a regressive dynamic in our communities. And so people tend to become less ethical, less emotionally attuned, less capable of interpersonal, meaningful interpersonal conversation, right? And so these trends are developmental opportunities, but they're also tend to be regressive, engender regressive dynamics. So how do we navigate that, right? Because there is this big gap, this cognitive gap, emotional gap, where many of our leaders are at and where we need them to be to better address these issues. People under pressure tend to regress. So how do we acknowledge that and deal with that and help people under pressure to grow and develop? I mean, so I'm not sure. It's going to be interesting to explore this theme with our guests.
Yeah, perhaps I'm not sure is a very good way to finish it. We are not sure. I love the first workshop that I went to see David Data. He started the workshop saying everything that I say is a lie. So perhaps this is an invitation to people. Everything that we say is a lie, but it is, at least is our perspective. And I hope it can help people to reflect on themselves. We are very excited to close in this first episode. We are going to have a monthly newsletter where we are going to kind of go in deeper and break it down, the issues and topics that we will be bringing to the episodes. We'll know more where this newsletter is going to be available, which platform we are going to use. For the Brazilians who doesn't speak English, this newsletter is going to be bilingual. It's going to be Portuguese and English. Then you guys can see and take a look and go in and deeper. I'm really feeling my heart open and warm, Sean. Feeling very happy and kind of grateful for this opportunity to another project with you. And then I'll just like to leave the floor open to you to do the final closing remarks for this first episode.
Yeah, likewise, I feel a lot of love and excitement and really looking forward to our new collaboration. I love the impulse of what you were saying a few moments ago about everything we say is a lie. I'll reframe that as everything that we say is a paradox. And it's actually not just a paradox, it's a metadox, right? So everything we say is a metadox. So I'll end on that note. I think that's a good one for us to complete today. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Great, Sean. Thank you. Love you, man.